So now after seeing this in theory, it's time to apply it in the demo of this course. I will again start in the store controller action in the meeting controller, and of course validation is the very first thing which happens in this controller, because data shouldn't be used before being validated, right? So as shown before, it's simply used by using the validate method on the controller itself, so calling the built-in validate method here, and then passing the injected request object. Next, I create the associative array specifying the fields which should be validated and the rules used for validation. Now when creating a new meeting, I certainly want to have a title, but the only validation I want to run on this title is the require rule, to make sure that a title is provided. The very same is true for the description, which also should be required, and no other rules are applied on this field. Now the time field is a little bit more interesting. It should also be required, but I'll chain another rule here, the date format rule, because I want to enforce a certain date format throughout this application. Now why is such a date format important? Because if your application stores this date in the database, you have to have a date format which can be interpreted by that database. And therefore it's important to kind of standardize the input date so that you can again run a standardized transformation on that date to store it in a uniform format. Hence I set up a date format with which I came up here, and you may change that if you prefer another one, which is defined by having a 4-digit year, then the month, then the day, then the hours and the minutes, and finally the time zone for which this time should be valid or in which this time lies. So the question is, how do I make sure that these characters I entered here lead to the date I want, or to the date format I want it to lead? Laravel's built-in date format validator uses the date formats PHP's built-in date create from format function uses. And on this page, to which a link will also be provided in the course materials, you'll find a table with a detailed explanation which character describes which part of a date or how the date may be encoded. Finally, I finished this validation here with the user ID, which only should be required, nothing else right now. Now as before, I will repeat this step for all other controller actions, and all I will do is I will alter this validation appropriately to check the respective values each controller action needs, or the data each controller action needs to function correctly. Now to give a quick guide through all the validations I just created, the update method just looks like the create or the store method here, since it takes the same data to work correctly. In the registration controller and the store controller action there, I just validate if a meeting and a user ID have been provided. And in the auth controller, I validate if name, email and password are provided, but note that the email is also checked with the email rule, which makes sure that email is a valid email format, so with an @ sign and .com or anything like that at the end. And password is validated with the minimum rule as well, which just makes sure that it has at least 5 characters in this case, since I want to enforce a certain minimum length of passwords. Now for signing in, I almost do have the same validators, but for demo purposes, I left out the min rule here for the password, because I don't really care how long the password here is, since I'm not creating a new user, I just want to sign a user in. So if the email is found in the database, I'll just compare the passwords, and if they don't match, the user is not signed in. If they match, the user is signed in. It's not important how long the password is, since this is already checked upon user creation in the sign up route. Great, so now that validation is in place, it's again time to test this with Postman and send requests to the routes. I'll try this out with creating a new meeting, and let me show you what happens if I now delete the title and send a request. As you can see, I get the error message that the title should be provided. So this works. What happens if I change the date format and just leave out the minutes? As you can see, this is now also added to the error JSON object I get back to tell me that the date format I specified is invalid. Let's also try this out for creating a new user. And let's say I want to create a user with a password shorter than 5 characters. Of course, I get back an error message that the password should be at least 5 characters long. Now, if I also delete the email address, or let's say I don't delete it, but I delete the @ sign to make it invalid, of course the error message is thrown that email is now no longer an valid email address.